I am Hamish Macbeth, and welcome to the Crimson Noir.
The sky over Lochtabuff was a thick, bruised purple, the kind of heavy Highland evening where the fog rolls off the sea loch in silent, ghost-like ribbons. It was the sort of damp, bone-chilling cold that usually kept the sensible residents of the village huddled by their peat fires. PC Hamish Macbeth, however, was currently crouched behind a jagged outcrop of rock near the Tommel estate, his long, lanky frame remarkably still. He wasn't on the lookout for criminals. He was waiting for a particular silver-scaled salmon to take the bait. Poaching from the local gentry was, in Hamish's estimation, a victimless crime, especially since the colonel had more fish than he had friends. A sudden, sharp whistle from his mongrel dog, Towser, alerted him. Hamish sighed. A long, mournful sound. He had been hoping for a quiet night with a poached fish and a hot cup of coffee, but the rhythmic crunch of gravel on the nearby road suggested that work, or worse, a stranger was approaching. He reeled in his line with a practiced, deceptive laziness, and stood up, smoothing his frayed uniform and pulling his peaked cap low over his fiery red hair. The intruder was a man who looked entirely too expensive for the rugged coast of Sutherland. Julian Vavasor, a name that sounded like a silk scarf caught in a ceiling fan, had arrived in Lochtabuff 3 days ago. A Sassenach of the most irritating variety, Vavasor was a flashy property developer who had bought the old derelict cannery at the edge of the harbour with plans to turn it into a luxury wellness retreat. He was currently standing by his gleaming silver sports car, checking a gold wristwatch and looking at the mist-shrouded village with a profound expression of distaste. "You there, Constable," Vavasor barked, his voice carrying the sharp, clipped tones of London boardrooms. He didn't wait for Hamish to approach, instead jabbing a manicured finger toward the harbour. "This place is a stagnant bog. The stench of fish and damp is quite frankly biological. I expect you to keep the local rabble away from my construction site. I've already seen several locals, if you can call them that, prying around the perimeter." Hamish adopted his most vacant, bovine expression, blinking slowly as if the concept of property rights was a new and confusing mystery. "Well now, sir," Hamish drawled, his Highland lilt thickening until it was nearly a parody. "The folks here are just curious. We don't get many silver cars in Lochtabuff. Most things here are brown or green or, well, wet. It's a very curious thing. A wellness retreat. Is that for people who aren't feeling very well? Then," Vavasor scoffed, returning to his car, "it's for people who have more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes, Macbeth. Now, do try to look like you're patrolling. I pay my taxes, even in this godforsaken corner of the world, and I expect results." He climbed into the car. The engine let out a roar that echoed off the mountains like a startled beast, and he sped away toward the hotel. Hamish watched the taillights vanish into the fog, his hazel eyes losing their dopey glaze for a brief, sharp second. Vavasor was a man who thought he could buy the silence of the hills. He had already insulted the postmistress's tea, complained about the church bells, and threatened to sue the local fishermen for visual pollution. Hamish whistled for Towser and began the walk back toward the village, his stomach grumbling with the lack of salmon. The air felt heavy, and not just with the impending rain. In a village like Lochtabuff, people didn't take kindly to being called rabble by a man in a silver car. As he passed the dark, hulking shape of the old cannery, the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the quay. Hamish had a dark, sinking feeling that the wellness Vavasor was looking for was about to be interrupted by something much more permanent. "Come on, Towser," Hamish muttered, adjusting his belt. "Let's see if Mrs. Anstruther has some leftover stew. I have a feeling the morning is going to be a very long one." Wes. The damp mist of the Highland night had finally surrendered to a thin, watery dawn that did little to warm the bones of Lochtabuff. Hamish Macbeth had spent a restless night in the police station, the promised stew from Mrs. Anstruther sitting heavy in his stomach, while the wind rattled the window panes like a debt collector. He had just managed to coax a thin, blue flame from his peat fire and was waiting for the kettle to whistle when the peace of the morning was shattered. It wasn't the telephone this time, but the frantic, rhythmic clanging of the old ship's bell at the end of the pier. a sound usually reserved for storms or a boat in distress. With a weary groan that seemed to echo the creak of the floorboards, Hamish pulled on his heavy greatcoat, jammed his peaked cap over his fiery red hair, and whistled for Towser. The harbour was a soup of grey fog and salt spray. A small group of fishermen, their faces like weathered granite, stood gathered near the edge of the stone quay, peering down into the churning, dark water where the tide was pulling aggressively at the pilings of the old cannery. Geordie, the village's most nervous deckhand, was pointing a trembling finger at something snagged on a rusted iron ladder. Hamish pushed through the group, his long legs moving with a deceptive, lazy grace that masked the sudden, sharp focus in his hazel eyes. He looked down and felt a sharp prickle of annoyance. His quiet day, his plans for a secondary attempt at the Tommel salmon, and his general desire to remain vertical and stationary were all officially ruined. Julian Vavasor was no longer concerned with property values or visual pollution. The flashy developer was bobbing face down in the kelp, his expensive cashmere overcoat bloated with seawater like a dead seal. But it was the manner of his arrival in the afterlife that caused the fishermen to mutter darkly and cross themselves. Vavasor hadn't simply fallen in. He had been intricately entangled in a massive weighted herring net, his manicured hands clutching at the mesh as if he had been trying to climb his way out of a nightmare. Even more humiliatingly, a bright orange lobster buoy was looped firmly around his neck, bobbing cheerfully in the surf above his submerged head. It was a death that was as bizarre as it was public, a Highland pantomime of a murder that seemed designed to mock the man's metropolitan elegance. "Right then," Hamish murmured, his voice a soft, slow drawl that betrayed nothing of his internal calculations. "He's stone dead, and he's caught in the wrong season for herring. Geordie, go fetch a sturdy rope. We can't have the tide taking the evidence out to the Minch." He knelt at the edge of the quay, observing how the net had been knotted. It wasn't a casual entanglement. It was the work of someone who knew the sea, someone who understood exactly how to make a body stay put while the world woke up to see it. Towser let out a low, mournful howl, his nose twitching at the scent of salt, and something metallic that lingered in the air, despite the brine. Hamish stood up and scanned the pier. The silver sports car was still parked exactly where Vavasor had left it, the dew on its hood, untouched, looking like a discarded toy in the rugged landscape. He noticed a small, dark smudge on the driver's side handle, not mud, but the greasy, black soot often found in the chimneys of the older cottages. He didn't touch it, merely blinked slowly as if he were struggling to stay awake. He knew that within the hour, the silence of the village would be a memory. The screech of tires and the roar of a megaphone would herald the arrival of the professionals from Strathbane. Is he murdered, Hamish?" Geordie asked, his voice cracking as he returned with a coil of hemp. Hamish took the rope, his eyes fixed on the distant, fog-shrouded peaks. "Well, Geordie, men don't usually knit themselves into herring nets for the sport of it. It's a very untidy business, and I fear the village is about to get a lot noisier before the sun sets." Even as he spoke, the faint, high-pitched wail of a police siren began to bounce off the mountains, growing louder and more insistent. It was the sound of Detective Chief Inspector Blair, and it meant that Hamish's role as a policeman was about to be reduced to that of a spectator in his own home. He took a final look at the orange buoy, wondering which of his neighbours had such a wicked sense of theatre. The high-pitched, neurotic wail of the police siren grew into a deafening roar as a mud-spattered white van skidded around the corner of the harbour wall, nearly clipping a stack of lobster creels. The passenger door flew open before the vehicle had even come to a complete halt, and out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair. He was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of high blood pressure and cheap polyester, his face already a dangerous, pulsating shade of crimson that clashed horribly with the morning mist. Behind him trailed the perpetually exhausted Detective Jimmy Anderson, looking as though he had already spent the entire drive being shouted at in the cramped, tobacco-scented confines of the van. Blair didn't bother with the scenery. He marched straight toward the edge of the quay, his heavy boots obliterating the delicate soot smudge. Hamish had been quietly guarding on the sports car's handle. "Out of the way, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the surrounding mountains. and causing a parliament of crows to take flight from the cannery roof in a black, flapping panic. What have you been doing? Standing here like a garden gnome while a taxpayer is hung out to dry. I might have known you'd be useless the moment a real crime occurred. You probably haven't even secured the perimeter. You lanky streak of Highland misery. Blair pushed past the huddle of fishermen, nearly knocking Geordie into the very water he had just been lamenting. He peered over the edge at the bobbing, orange, void remains of Julian Vavasor, and for a fleeting second, even he was struck, dumb by the sheer, theatrical absurdity of the scene. "Good God," Blair whispered, before his usual arrogance returned with a vengeance. "It's a ritual killing, a bloody Highland sacrifice. I knew this village was full of primitive savages. Anderson, get the photographer down here immediately. And you, Macbeth, get out of my light. You've likely trampled all over every piece of evidence within a 5-mile radius with those great, clod-hopping boots of yours." Hamish remained perfectly still, his hazel eyes drifting toward the ceiling of the grey sky, as if he were contemplating the price of wool. He adopted his most vacant, bovine expression, blinking slowly as if Blair's words were a complex foreign language he was trying to translate. "It's a herring net, sir," Hamish offered in his softest, most infuriatingly slow Highland drawl. "And that's a buoy from the Nancy Rose. Though it's been painted over recently, I believe, it's a very untidy way to go." To be sure, Blair rounded on him, his neck veins throbbing like a disturbed nest of vipers. "Don't you try to teach me my job, you rustic imbecile. I can see what it is. It's obvious what happened here. This Vavasor fellow comes up here with his fancy car and his London manners, insults the local rabble, and one of you peasants decides to play at being a judge and executioner. Who was it he was arguing with? I want a name, and I want it now." "He had words with many people, sir," Hamish replied, scratching his fiery red hair with a deceptive air of profound confusion. "But he was particularly hard on Angus the smith, and he had a row with the postmistress about his marmalade. Then there was Willie the piper, who didn't like being called visual pollution." Blair didn't wait for him to finish. He snapped his thick, nicotine-stained fingers at Anderson. "The smith, the big one with the hammer. He's the most obvious suspect. He has the strength to toss a man like a caber and the tools to weigh him down. Anderson, get him into the van. I'll break him in 20 minutes and be back in Strathbane for my tea." "But, sir," Hamish murmured, his voice barely a whisper against the rising wind, "Angus has a bad back, and he was at the Sealid in Leg until 2 inches the morning." Blair let out a sound like a steam engine reaching its limit. A sharp, wheezing hiss of pure contempt. "Shut your mouth, Macbeth. You are officially sidelined. Go and direct the tourists, or whatever it is you do to pretend you earn a wage. Leave real policing to the professionals. I'll have a confession before the tide turns, and you'll still be trying to figure out which end of a notebook is which." As Blair stomped back toward the van, his boots echoing with self-importance, Hamish looked at the empty silver car and the way the sea spray was beginning to wash away the soot. He knew Blair was heading in the wrong direction at a high rate of speed, but he wasn't about to correct him. He had his own way of finding the truth, and it didn't involve shouting at frightened men in a cold interview room. The blue and white police van roared away from the quay, its tires spitting gravel as DCI Blair headed toward the smithy to harass a man who spent his days wrestling iron and his nights playing the fiddle. Hamish Macbeth stood in the dissipating fog, his hands shoved deep into his greatcoat pockets, watching the spectacle with a look of profound, vacant contemplation. To any passerby, he appeared to be daydreaming about a particularly interesting rock. But beneath the peaked cap, his mind was sorting through the village's social architecture. Blair was a man who hunted with a sledgehammer, but Hamish knew that in Lochduff, the truth was usually caught with a fine net and a great deal of patience. He whistled low for Towser, and the two began their slow, rhythmic trudge back toward the village centre, far away from the yellow police tape and the frantic snapping of the forensic photographer's camera. His first stop was the post office, a small, cluttered room that smelled of damp wool and old adhesive. Mrs. Wellington was behind the counter, her face a mask of ironclad respectability that hid a heart as sharp as a gutting knife. She was currently sorting the mail with an aggressive precision that suggested she was personally offended by every envelope. Hamish leaned against the counter, looking as though he might fall asleep at any moment. "A terrible business down at the Harbour, Mrs. Wellington," he drawled, his voice a soft Highland lilt. "DCI Blair is convinced it's the work of a giant, or at least a man with a very heavy hammer. I don't suppose you saw any giants fetching their morning papers lately?" Mrs. Wellington snorted, her spectacles sliding down her nose. "Blair is a fool, Hamish Macbeth, and you're not much better for standing there like a wet sack. That Vavasor man was a menace. He was in here yesterday afternoon, shouting about his special organic marmalade, not arriving from London. He told me I was a relic of a bygone era, and that I should be replaced by an automated locker system. He even threatened to report me to the regional manager for general inefficiency, because I couldn't find his silk pocket squares in the local delivery." Hamish nodded sympathetically, his eyes drifting toward the small, soot-stained fireplace in the back room. "A relic, is it? That's a very modern word for a man who ended up in a very old-fashioned herring net. Did he mention anyone else he'd managed to offend before he took his final swim?" The postmistress paused, a heavy parcel in her hands. "He was arguing with the minister's wife, Mrs. Halbert, about the noise of the church bells. Said they interfered with his mindfulness sessions. And he had a row with the curry shop owner about the smell of garlic near the cannery. But if you want to know who really hated him, you should ask why he was so keen on the old property deeds for the quay. He spent hours in the records office, claiming half the village was encroaching on his territory." Hamish thanked her with a polite tip of his cap and wandered back out into the mist. He wasn't looking for a giant. He was looking for someone with a grudge that was small, petty, and deeply personal. He spent the next hour mooching his way across Lochduff. At the curry shop, he accepted a steaming cup of tea and learned that Vavasor had tried to get the shop's outdoor seating permit revoked. At the local hotel, he learned from a disgruntled maid that the developer had refused to pay his bill because there was too much nature outside his window. By the time he reached the pier again, his stomach was rummaging for a late breakfast. But his head was full of the victim's dirty secrets. Vavasor hadn't just been a developer. He had been a systematic bully who used the law to squeeze the locals out of their own heritage. Hamish sat on a bollard, watching the Nancy Rose bob in the water. The orange buoy on Vavasor's neck had been a signature, a piece of village theatre that pointed directly toward the fishing fleet, which was exactly why Hamish was starting to doubt it. It was too loud, too deliberate. Much like DCI Blair himself. He noticed the soot on his own sleeve from leaning against the post office counter and remembered the smudge on the silver car. The killer wasn't a man of the sea. They were someone who spent their time in the dark, smoky corners of the village, watching the world through a window and waiting for the right moment to strike. He needed a different perspective, one that understood the subtle shift in social standing that a luxury retreat would bring to the Highland gentry. He turned his eyes toward the sprawling estate of Halbert and Smythe. Knowing it was time to consult Priscilla, the mist had begun to lift, peeling back from the heather-clad slopes of the Tommel estate like a damp grey shroud. But the air remained bitingly cold. Hamish trudged up the long, winding driveway toward the ancestral home of the Halbert and Smythes, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. He felt the usual tug of inadequacy that always accompanied a visit to the big house, a feeling exacerbated by his slightly frayed uniform and the lingering scent of Mrs. Wellington's post office coal smoke on his sleeves. Towser trotted ahead, his tail wagging with a sudden aristocratic vigor as he spotted a silver Land Rover parked near the grand stone portico. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was just stepping out of the vehicle, her blonde hair perfectly framed by a silk headscarf that probably cost more than Hamish's annual boot allowance. She looked at him with a mixture of weary amusement and genuine concern. "Hamish," she said, her voice like clear water over Highland stones. "I heard the news from the village. It seems Julian Vavasor has finally found the piece he was so desperately marketing, though I doubt he intended to find it at the bottom of the harbour." Hamish leaned against a stone pillar, removing his peaked cap to reveal a shock of damp, fiery red hair. He adopted his most vacant, harmless expression, the one that usually prompted people to tell him far more than they intended. A very untidy business, Priscilla. DCI Blair is currently at the smithy, trying to arrest Angus for being too large, and having a hammer, which is a bit like arresting the mountains for being too tall. But I was wondering, did Vavasour have friends in higher circles? Or was he as popular with the gentry as he was with the postmistress? Priscilla sighed, leaning against the Land Rover. He was a parasite, Hamish. He came to Papa 3 weeks ago with a plan to rejuvenate the estate by turning the old tenant cottages into a timeshare complex. When Papa refused, Vavasour threatened to use some obscure Victorian zoning law to claim the access road as public property. He was a man who lived in the fine print of legal documents, looking for ways to squeeze people out of their own history. She paused, her blue eyes narrowing. But there was something else. He was obsessed with the old cannery deeds. He claimed there was a blood right clause in the original charter that meant the land could only be held by a direct descendant of the original founder. He was trying to prove that the current owner, Mr. Gupta at the curry shop, didn't actually have a legal leg to stand on. Hamish scratched his chin, his mind whirring beneath the sleepy facade. A blood right, is it? That's a very old-fashioned thing for a man with a silver sports car to be worried about. Priscilla nodded, stepping closer. He wasn't just building a retreat, Hamish. He was looking for a way to seize the entire waterfront. He'd found something in the Edinburgh archives, a name, or a missing branch of a family tree. He told me at the last hunt ball that Lochtabuff was built on a foundation of stolen identities, and that he was the only one with the keys to the truth. Hamish looked toward the village, where the smoke from the chimneys was beginning to rise in thin, vertical lines. The soot on his sleeve, the smudge on the car handle, and the bizarrely theatrical orange buoy was starting to form a pattern that had nothing to do with fishing and everything to do with social standing. Stolen identities, Hamish murmured, more to himself than to Priscilla. That's a very heavy thing to carry into a harbour. He thanked her with a polite tip of his cap, his hazel eyes losing their dopey glaze for a sharp, crystalline second. He knew now that the murder wasn't a spontaneous act of village rage. It was a desperate, calculated move by someone who stood to lose everything if Vavasour's legal digging reached the surface. The killer wasn't someone who worked with their hands in the open air. They were someone who lived in the shadows of their own past, polishing a reputation that was as fake as a plastic pearl. As he turned to leave, Priscilla called out after him, "Be careful, Hamish. Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and if you get in his way, he'll have you transferred to a rainy beat in Glasgow before the week is out." Hamish offered a slow, deceptive smile. "I've no intention of going to Glasgow. Priscilla, the coffee there is far too bitter." He whistled for Towser and began the walk back down the hill, his mind already drifting toward the small, cramped office of the village records. The silver Land Rover grew smaller in the distance as Hamish descended the winding estate road, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the only sound in the damp Highland air. Priscilla's words about stolen identities and the foundation of Lochduff rattled around his brain like a loose stone in a tin bucket. If Julian Vavasour had been digging into the genealogical roots of the waterfront, he hadn't just been an annoying Sassenach with a penchant for luxury. He had been a man holding a match to a very old, very dry fuse. Hamish reached the bottom of the hill and paused by the village records office, a small, grey stone building that looked as though it were being slowly reclaimed by the surrounding ivy. He didn't go inside, however, because the peace of the afternoon was shattered by a familiar, high-pitched roar coming from the direction of the police station. DCI Blair was in the middle of the street, his face a dangerous shade of purple that suggested he might spontaneously combust at any moment. He was currently looming over Angus the Smith, who was being led toward the police van by a deeply embarrassed Jimmy Anderson. Angus, a man whose shoulders were broad enough to span a narrow glen, looked more confused than guilty, his large, soot-stained hands hanging uselessly at his sides. "I've got him, Macbeth," Blair bellowed, spotting Hamish's lanky frame. "A textbook arrest? We found the motive. Vavasour was going to sue the smithy for noise pollution. And we found the weapon." a heavy iron grappling hook in the back of Angus's shed, still wet with salt water. It's all over, but the paperwork, you useless Highland peasant. Hamish wandered closer, his face a mask of dull-witted compliance. He blinked slowly at the handcuffs glinting on Angus's wrists. "A grappling hook, sir?" Hamish drawled, his voice a soft, meandering lilt. "And did Angus say how he managed to knit a 30-foot herring net while he was at the Sealith, in Lerg? Or why would he leave a wet hook in his own shed instead of tossing it into the Minch?" Blair let out a sound like a steam engine reaching its limit. "Adrenaline, you fool," he panicked. "And as for the net, any man in this godforsaken village can throw a net. Don't you try to teach me my job. I'm taking him to Strathbane for formal questioning, and I expect the commendation on my desk by Monday." Hamish scratched his red hair, his eyes darting toward the crowd of villagers who had gathered to watch the spectacle. Among them was Mrs. Wellington from the post office, her spectacles glinting in the pale light, and the local registrar, a small, meticulous man named Mr. Henderson, who looked as though he were carved from old parchment. Hamish noticed something odd then. A subtle, fleeting movement, missed. Termiscas. Henderson was surreptitiously wiping his hands on his trousers. A nervous, repetitive motion, but it wasn't the movement that caught Hamish's eye. It was what was on the registrar's cuff, a small, bright orange smudge, the exact shade of the lobster buoy that had been looped around Vavasor's neck. "Just a moment, sir," Hamish murmured, stepping toward the police van as Blair prepared to slam the door. "I noticed something on the car earlier, a smudge of soot. Now Angus here is a smith, so he's covered in the stuff, which makes him a very tidy suspect for a man who likes tidy answers." Blair sneered, his hand on the doorknob. "Exactly." Finally, a spark of intelligence from the village idiot. "It's soot. He's a smith." Case closed. Hamish tilted his head, his hazel eyes sharpening for a split second. "Aye, but the soot on the car handle was greasy, sir. Like the kind you get from an old, poorly ventilated domestic chimney. The kind they still have in the registrar's office. Not the dry, coal, dust soot from a forge. And Angus hasn't used orange marine paint in 20 years. Not since he gave up his boat." Blair's face contorted with rage at the interruption. "I don't care about soot chemistry, Macbeth. I have a suspect, I have a gun, I have a motive. Get out of my way before I charge you with obstruction." He slammed the van door, the metallic thud echoing off the stone cottages as the van roared, skidding on the wet tarmac. The villagers began to disperse. Hamish stood alone in the street, watching Mr. Henderson hurry back toward the records office, his head ducked low against the wind. The obvious suspect was heading to a cell in Strathbane, but the man with the orange paint on his cuff and the greasy soot on his hands was heading back to the files. Hamish knew he had less than an hour to find the truth, before Blair's vanity turned a mistake into a permanent injustice. He whistled for Towser and began to walk, not toward the station, but toward the dark, smoky shadows of the archives. The roar of the police van's engine faded into a thin, lonely whine as it climbed the brae toward the Strathbane road, leaving a heavy, expectant silence in its wake. Hamish Macbeth stood in the centre of the village street, his long shadow stretching toward the harbour where Julian Vavasor had met his remarkably colourful end. To the casual observer, the village constable looked like a man who had forgotten why he had stepped outside, his mouth slightly agape and his eyes fixed on a stray gull circling the quay. But beneath the deceptive stillness, Hamish was watching Mr. Henderson. The registrar's retreat was not the brisk walk of a busy official. It was the frantic, scuttling flight of a man who felt the cold breath of the law on the back of his neck. Hamish whistled low for Towser, and together they began a slow, meandering journey toward the records office, careful to keep a respectable distance to avoid spooking the quarry too soon. The records office was a cramped, subterranean space that smelled of damp parchment, ancient glue, and the greasy coal fire soot Hamish had noted on Vavasor's car handle. As he pushed open the heavy creaking door, the bell gave a solitary, mournful ting. Mr. Henderson was hunched over a large mahogany desk, his small, ink-stained hands frantically shuffling through a stack of yellowed ledgers. He jumped nearly a foot into the air at the sound of the bell, his spectacles sliding to the very tip of his sharp, bird-like nose. "Macbeth," he gasped, his voice thin and reedy. "What are you doing here? DCI Blair told me the matter was concluded." "He's taken the Smith, hasn't he? The village is safe." Hamish wandered over to a shelf of oversized birth registries, his hazel eyes scanning the room with a sharp, hidden intensity that belied his lazy posture. "Well now, Mr. Henderson," Hamish drawled, his Highland lilt at its most soothing. "Blair is a man who likes to move fast, like a mountain stream after a storm. But sometimes a fast stream just carries a lot of mud." "I was thinking about what Priscilla Halberton," Smythe said, "about stolen identities and foundations built on lies. Vavasour was a very greedy man, was he not? He spent a lot of time here, digging through the old cannery deeds and the lineage of the Waterfront families." Henderson's face, already pale, turned the color of curdled milk. He tried to hide his hands beneath the desk, but the orange smudge on his cuff was as bright as a signal flare in the dim light of the office. "He was a nuisance," Henderson hissed, his eyes darting toward a locked cabinet in the corner. "A man with no respect for the sanctity of the archives. He thought he could just walk in here and strip away a century of respectability for the sake of a wellness retreat. He was looking for a branch of the family that didn't exist. Macbeth, he was trying to prove that the Hendersons didn't own the registrar's cottage, that we were just squatters with a fancy title." Hamish leaned against a stack of marriage licenses, looking as though he might drop off to sleep at any moment. "Squatters, is it? That's a very harsh word for a man whose family has kept the village books for 3 generations. But Vavasour found something, didn't he? Not about the cottage, but about you. He found that the real Mr. Henderson died in a Glasgow tenement 60 years ago, and that a clever young clerk with a knack for forging signatures decided to move north and start a new life in a quiet village where nobody asked too many questions. He wasn't just building a retreat, was he? He was blackmailing you for the deeds to the entire Harbour front, using your own forged past as the lever." The reedy man slumped into his chair, the weight of the secret finally crushing the air from his lungs. The motive wasn't the grand, sweeping greed Blair expected. It was the petty, terrified self-preservation of a man who had spent his entire life pretending to be someone else. Henderson had spent decades as the pillar of Lockdove's bureaucracy, and the thought of being exposed as a fraud by a flashy Sassenach was more than his pride could bear. He had lured Vavasour to the quay under the pretense of handing over the real deeds, then used his knowledge of the old harbour nets and the orange paint he'd kept in his shed for the office shutters to craft a murder that pointed everywhere. But at a frail old clerk, Hamish stood up, his joints popping in the silence. He had the motive and the physical evidence on the cuff, but he knew Henderson would never confess to a useless peasant like himself. He needed to set a trap that would make the registrar reveal his hand in front of a witness Blair couldn't ignore. The heavy silence of the records office was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to be counting down the minutes of Mr. Henderson's stolen life. Hamish Macbeth stood by the door, his lanky frame silhouetted against the dim light filtering through the ivy-choked windows. He didn't move to arrest the man. He knew that a direct accusation would only cause the registrar to retreat into a shell of bureaucratic denials that DCI Blair would never have the patience to dismantle. Instead, Hamish adopted a look of profound, localized anxiety, the kind of expression that suggested a man who had just realized he'd left his stove on or his sheep gate open. He stepped back toward the mahogany desk, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, worried whisper that made Henderson flinch. "It is a terrible thing, Mr. Henderson," Hamish murmured, leaning in until the scent of stale tobacco and old parchment was thick between them. "DCI Blair is a man who likes quick results, to be sure. But I've just had a radio call from the forensic team in Strathbane. It seems they found a specific type of orange paint on the victim's neck, a very rare marine grade that was discontinued years ago. They're sending a specialist with a chemical sensor to check every shed and cottage in the village, starting at dawn. If that paint is found on a man's property, or heaven forbid, on his clothing, even Blair won't be able to ignore it. He watched the registrar's eyes dart toward the orange smudge on his cuff. Then, quickly away, the bird-like man was beginning to tremble, his small chest heaving under his tweed waistcoat. "A chemical sensor?" Henderson wheezed, his voice thin and jagged. "In Lockduff. That seems a bit excessive for a simple murder." Hamish nodded solemnly, his hazel eyes wide and entirely vacant of any hidden meaning. "Oh, the Home Office is very keen on these new gadgets, sir. They say it can detect a single paint molecule from 50 yards. But that's not the worst. They found a piece of a deed snagged in the victim's pocket half, burned but with enough of a signature left to suggest a forgery. Blair thinks the smith did it to hide a debt. But once that specialist arrives, he'll be looking at every signature in these ledgers with a microscope." Hamish straightens, adjusting his peaked cap with a sigh. "I'd best be off to the station to prepare the guest house for the technicians. I expect they'll want to start with the records office, seeing as it's the heart of the village. Good night to you, Mr. Henderson. Try to get some rest." Hamish stepped out into the damp Highland night, the bell on the door giving a final, lonely chime. He didn't head for the police station, however. Instead, he whistled low for Towser and circled back through the narrow, soot-stained alleyway that ran behind the archives. He knew the psychology of a man like Henderson. A man who had spent 60 years building a fortress of lies would not sit idly by while a chemical sensor dismantled his walls. He settled himself into the deep shadows of an old peat shed. Pulling his greatcoat tight against the rising chill, he didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, the back door of the records office creaked open, and a small, frantic figure emerged, clutching a heavy tin of paint and a bundle of old ledgers wrapped in a dark cloth. Henderson didn't head for the harbour, where the police tape was still flapping in the wind. Instead, he scurried toward the old, disused lime kiln at the edge of the village, a place where a fire could be lit without attracting too much attention in the mist. Hamish followed at a distance, his boots making no sound on the wet grass. He watched as the registrar reached the stone ruins and began to frantically pile dry gorse and heather into the mouth of the kiln. The man was sobbing now, a thin, pathetic sound that was swallowed by the roar of the sea below. He pulled a box of matches from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped the first 3 into the mud. "It's a very damp night for a bonfire, Mr. Henderson," Hamish said, his voice emerging from the darkness like a ghost. The registrar let out a strangled shriek, spinning around to see the lanky constable standing just a few feet away. In the distance, the twin beams of a car's headlights swung around the coastal road. Not the forensics team, but Blair's van returning from a fruitless interrogation at the smithy. Hamish hadn't called the technicians. He had simply called the station and told the dispatcher that he'd seen a suspicious light at the kiln. The trap was set. The man who had lived as a phantom was about to be illuminated by the very law he had spent a lifetime subverting. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Henderson looked at the matches, then at the sea, and finally at the calm, steady eyes of the policeman he had so deeply underestimated. The damp gorse hissed as Mr. Henderson struck a 4th match, the small flame flickering against the darkness before catching a dry tuft of heather. The orange glow illuminated his face, stripping away the mask of the mild-mannered registrar to reveal a terrified, cornered animal. Hamish Macbeth stood a few yards away, his long shadow stretching toward the mouth of the lime kiln like a silent accusation. The smell of paraffin and old paper began to compete with the salt air as the first lick of real fire reached the edge of the ledger Henderson held clutched to his chest. It was the ledger that contained the truth of 60 years of forgery, the one Vavasour had held over the old man's head, like a guillotine. "It's no use, Mr. Henderson," Hamish said, his voice soft and steady, cutting through the frantic crackle of the kindling. "Burning the books won't wash the orange paint off your sleeve, nor will it put the soul of the real James Henderson back into the grave you stole in Glasgow. You've lived a long life on a lie, and it's a heavy thing to try and burn away in a single night." The registrar looked at him, his eyes wide and glistening with tears of pure, distilled panic. He was going to take it all, Macbeth. He didn't care about the village. He just wanted the dirt. "I've been a good man here. I've kept the records, I've seen the births and the deaths, and I've been more of a Henderson than the drunkard who died in that tenement ever was. The wail of the police siren was no longer a distant ghost. It was a screaming reality, as the twin beams of the van's headlights swung around the final bend of the coastal road, illuminating the jagged stones of the kiln. The vehicle skidded to a halt, the engine cutting out to leave only the frantic clicking of the cooling metal. DCI Blair exploded from the driver's side, his face a mask of purple indignation, followed by a bewildered Jimmy Anderson. Blair took one look at the fire, the registrar, and Hamish standing calmly in the mist, and let out a roar that rivaled the Atlantic swell. "What is this, Macbeth? I leave you for an hour to process a suspect, and I find you hosting a bonfire with a civil servant." Blair stomped forward, his heavy boots crushing the wet heather. He stopped dead when he saw the tin of marine paint sitting at Henderson's feet and the charred edges of the ledger. Is that the evidence from the records office? Henderson, what in the name of God are you doing? The registrar didn't answer. Instead, he made a sudden, desperate lunge toward the kiln, intending to heave the entire bundle into the heart of the flames. Hamish moved with a deceptive, feline speed that caught everyone off guard. He didn't tackle the old man. He simply reached out and caught the registrar's wrist, twisting it just enough to make the heavy ledger thud onto the damp grass, safely away from the fire. Henderson collapsed into a heap, sobbing into his ink-stained hands as the fight finally left him. Hamish stepped back, his expression returning to that of a slightly bored, sleepy-eyed observer. "I believe Mr. Henderson was just trying to tidy up some old clerical errors, sir," Hamish drawled, his Highland lilt thickening. "It seems he had a bit of an accident with a buoy earlier tonight, and he was worried the orange paint might clash with his office decor." Blair's jaw dropped as he looked from the sobbing man to the bright orange smudge on the cuff. The realization began to dawn on him. Not the truth of the forgery, which was too complex for his blunt mind, but the fact that he was standing in front of a much better, much more theatrical killer than the Smith. "The paint," Blair whispered, his eyes narrowing as he sensed a promotion. "The orange boy, Anderson. Get the cuffs on him, and secure those books. I knew Smith was too simple for such a job." This was a calculated, bureaucratic execution. He rounded on Hamish, his finger jabbing into the air. "And you, Macbeth, standing there watching him burn the evidence. If I hadn't arrived exactly when I did, the whole case would have gone up in smoke. You're lucky I'm in a good mood, or I'd have you in the back of the van for gross negligence." Hamish merely tipped his cap, his hazel eyes losing their sharpness, as he watched Anderson lead the broken registrar toward the van. "Aye, sir. It's good to have such a good sense of timing. I was just thinking how much I'd hate to be the one to explain all those missing signatures to the chief constable." Blair snorted, already rehearsing his victory speech for the Strathbane press, entirely unaware that the man he had just arrested was a ghost. The man who had caught him was already dreaming of a warm peat fire and a quiet night in Lockduff. The heavy doors of the police van slammed shut with a finality that echoed across the dark, jagged rocks of the Highland coast. Inside, the broken figure of the man who wasn't James Henderson sat huddled in his tweed coat, his stolen life finally stripped away by the glare of DCI Blair's flashlight. The vehicle lurched into gear, its tires churning through the wet heather as Blair leaned out of the window to bark a final, condescending order at the lanky constable standing in the mist. "And don't forget to douse that fire, Macbeth. I've done the heavy lifting, but I expect you to handle the menial cleanup. I'll be expecting a full report on my desk in Strathbane, though I'll likely have to rewrite every word of your rural gibberish." Hamish watched the taillight's red glow fade into the fog, until the sound of the engine was nothing more than a memory. Beside him, Jimmy Anderson lingered for a moment, his breath hitching in the cold. "You're a strange one, Hamish," Anderson whispered, shaking his head, "giving him the credit for the chemical sensor theory, when we both know you made it up on the spot to flush the old man out. He's going to get a commendation for this, and you'll still be poaching salmon in a threadbare tunic." Hamish scratched his fiery red hair and offered a slow, deceptive lilt of a smile. "Now, Jimmy, if the superintendent thinks I'm a genius, he'll have me sitting in a grey office in Glasgow, breathing in bus fumes and filling out forms in triplicate." But if he thinks DCI Blair is the hero of the Highlands, then Blair stays busy in the city, and I stay right here where the air is clean and the fish are plentiful. It's a fair trade, wouldn't you say? Anderson chuckled, patted Hamish on the shoulder, and climbed into the support car, leaving the village to its rightful silence. Hamish turned and trudged back toward the village. The Sassenach Vavasor was gone, the Henderson secret was buried once more, and the social order of Lochdoverf had been restored to its quiet, skeptical equilibrium. He walked back to the police station, his boots squeaking on the damp grass. Inside, the peat fire had burned to a comforting orange glow. Towser was already reclaiming his spot on the rug, and Sunsy was perched on the cupboard, her tail twitching in a silent demand for supper. Hamish moved to the small stove and set a pot of water to boil. He reached into the back of the pantry and pulled out a hidden stash of real Highland butter and a thick slice of bread, ironic, perhaps. But it was the best way to end a long night. As the steam rose from his mug of coffee, Hamish sat by the window and looked out at the harbour. The moon was beginning to peek through the clouds, illuminating the quiet quay where the Nancy Rose bobbed peacefully in the tide. The orange buoy was gone. The soot was washed away, and tomorrow, the village would return to gossiping about nothing more dangerous than the price of marmalade. He took a long, hot sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread to his tired bones. To the world in Strathbane, he was a useless peasant who had lucked into a front-row seat for a DCI's brilliance. To the people of Lochdoverf, he was just Hamish, the man who sat quietly and listened to the things they didn't say. He leaned back in his chair, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips. The storm had passed, the village was at peace, and most importantly, he was exactly where he belonged.